Edward Arden's severed head was impaled upon London Bridge, while his body was brutally quartered, a horrific end intended for the vilest of traitors in 1583. Yet the tragedy that led this nobleman to the scaffold was not a conspiracy against the crown, but a fatal error of arrogance, daring to insult Robert Dudley, the cherished lover of Queen Elizabeth I. Blinded by ancient pride, Ardan committed the ultimate taboo by branding Dudley a low-born adulterer, failing to realize that an attack on the favorite was a direct strike against the Queen herself. Elizabeth signed the savage execution warrant without hesitation, coldly using a nobleman's blood to cleanse the insult and protect the honor of the man she loved. The old feudal order, the England of knights, local lords, and ancient Catholicism, was being ruthlessly dismantled. In its place rose a new centralized state, powered by new men. These were the ambitious, the ruthless, and the newly rich who owed their status not to centuries of history, but to a piece of paper signed by the monarch. It was a collision of eras, the bedrock of the medieval past grinding against the tectonic plate of a modern, bureaucratic future. And standing directly on the fault line, immovable and proud, was Edward Arden. Edward Arden was not merely a gentleman, he was a living monument. He resided at Park Hall in Warwickshire, a manor house that reflected its master, heavy, fortified, and resistant to change. The hall was a place of oak and stone smelling of wood smoke and beeswax, a bastion of the old ways. But Arden's true fortress was his genealogy. In a court filled with social climbers and merchant princes pretending to be aristocrats, the name Arden commanded a reverence that money could not buy. The Ardens were one of the very few families in all of England who could trace their lineage in an unbroken male line back to the days of the Anglo-Saxons. His ancestor, Turkill de Arden, had been a great lord in Warwickshire when William the Conqueror landed in 1066. While other Saxon families were wiped out or absorbed, the Ardens survived. They held their ground. They kept their name. For 500 years, they had been the unofficial kings of the Warwickshire woodlands. To Edward, the soil of the county wasn't just property. It was his flesh and blood. He looked at the world with the specific, arrogant confidence of a man who knows his family has survived civil wars, plagues, and usurpations. He did not feel the need to bow and scrape. He did not feel the need to curry favor. He was an Arden. That used to be enough, but in Elizabeth's England, being an Arden was also a liability. Edward was a recusant, a steadfast Catholic who refused to bend the knee to the new Protestant Church of England. In the privacy of Park Hall, the Latin Mass was still whispered. A priest, Hugh Hall, lived with the family disguised variously as a gardener or steward. This was a capital crime, treason, by the letter of the law. Yet in the Midlands, where the Reformation had been slow to take root, Arden's faith was an open secret, tolerated by neighbors who respected his bloodline more than the Queen's statutes. He might have lived out his days in this dangerous but stable equilibrium had he not made an enemy of the most powerful man in the kingdom. Just a few miles away from the ancient stones of Park Hall rose the red sandstone towers of Kenilworth Castle. This was the seat of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. If Arden represented the stubborn past, Dudley was the terrifying, glittering future. Robert Dudley was the superstar of the age, tall, athletic, incredibly handsome, and flamboyantly dressed. He was the Queen's sweet Robin. He was the master of the horse, a privy councillor, and the recipient of vast monopolies in lands. He was the sun around which the court orbited. But Edward Arden looked at Robert Dudley and saw filth. To a man of Arden's pedigree, Dudley was a parvenu, an upstart, a man of no breeding who had risen too high, too fast. The Dudley family history was a catalogue of treason and overreach. Robert's grandfather, Edmund Dudley, had been executed by Henry VIII for extortion. Robert's father, the Duke of Northumberland, had been beheaded for trying to steal the throne for Lady Jane Grey. Robert himself had narrowly escaped the axe, spending his youth in the Tower of London. Ardan viewed Dudley not as a peer, but as the son and grandson of traitors, a man whose coat of arms was painted over the stain of blood. Ardan looked at the massive expansion of Kenilworth, the new towers, the vast man-made lake, the deer parks, and he didn't see grandeur. He saw theft. He saw a man compensating for his lack of history with an excess of gold. It was a clash of values that was destined to turn violent. The man who was the land versus the man who owned the land. The tension between Park Hall and Kenilworth began as a simmer, a neighborly dispute that festered into a blood feud. It started, as these things often do, with boundaries. In the early 1570s, Dudley began aggressively expanding his estates. He wanted more timber for his buildings, more land for his hunting parks. He began to encroach on the common lands and the rights of the local gentry. Most men in Warwickshire, terrified of the Queen's favorite, bowed their heads and accepted the encroachment. They sold their rights for a pittance or simply moved aside. Edward Arden did not. Arden launched a legal war. He sued the Earl of Leicester. It was a breathtaking act of defiance. Imagine a small-town mayor suing the prime minister in a court system the prime minister controls. Arden wrote furious letters, contesting boundaries, arguing over timber rights, and publicly calling Dudley a tyrant who trampled on the ancient liberties of the English gentleman. He referred to Dudley's actions as oppression. He refused to be bought out. He refused to be intimidated. For Dudley, this was more than an annoyance. It was a humiliation. Dudley was a man of immense vanity, deeply insecure about his family's traitorous reputation. He craved the validation of the old nobility. He wanted to be accepted as the great lord of the Midlands, and here was Edward Arden, a man with less money but better blood, treating him like a common thief. Arden was a living reminder of everything Dudley lacked: authenticity. The simmering pot boiled over in the summer of 1575. This was the year Robert Dudley played his greatest hand. He hosted Queen Elizabeth at Kenilworth for a 19-day festival that would go down in history as the most lavish party of the century. It was a final, desperate attempt to woo the Queen into marriage. Dudley pulled out all the stops. He built a floating island on his artificial lake. He commissioned fireworks that sounded like thunder. He hired actors, poets, and musicians. The cost was astronomical, enough to bankrupt a small nation. To ensure the spectacle was perfect, Dudley issued a summons to the local gentry of Warwickshire. He invited them to attend the Queen, to form a guard of honor, and to participate in the pageantry. But there was a condition. The local gentlemen were expected to wear Dudley's livery. In the feudal world, livery was a uniform, a coat or a badge bearing the lord's crest. In this case, it was the bare and ragged staff, the ancient symbol of the Earls of Warwick that Dudley had appropriated. To wear a man's livery was a legal and symbolic act of submission. It meant you were part of his affinity, his household. It meant you were his man. For a minor squire, wearing the Earl's badge was a career-making opportunity. It was a sign of favor. But for Edward Arden, the High Sheriff of Warwickshire, the request was a mortal insult. It was a demand that he, a descendant of Saxon lords, put on a slave collar and march in the parade of a traitor's son. Arden's reaction was explosive. He did not politely decline the invitation, claiming illness. He did not send a proxy. He publicly, loudly, and viciously refused. Witnesses recount that Ardan declared he would not wear the Earl's livery as long as he lived. He stated that he was a gentleman of Warwickshire, holding his lands directly from the crown and his ancestors, not a lackey to be dressed up for a carnival. He stripped the bare and ragged staff of its power, dismissing it as the badge of a pretender. If Ardan had stopped at refusing the badge, he might have survived. He would have been fined, perhaps briefly imprisoned for disrespect, but he would have kept his head. But Ardan was a man possessed by the fatal pride of his caste. He could not just refuse, he had to destroy. In the heat of the dispute, likely in a public setting where his words would be carried back to Kenilworth by a dozen spies, Edward Arden uttered the words that would eventually kill him. He attacked Robert Dudley's moral character with a ferocity that shocked the county. He called the Earl of Leicester an upstart. He called him an oppressor. And then he dropped the two words that were tantamount to suicide. He called Robert Dudley a whoremaster, and he called him an adulterer. These were not casual slurs. In the context of 1575, they were political dynamite. By calling Dudley an adulterer, Ardan was implicating the Queen herself. Elizabeth was the Virgin Queen. Her political power relied on her image of chaste untouchability. If Dudley was an adulterer, who was the other woman? The gossip in Europe was that Dudley and the Queen were lovers. By using that word, Ardan was giving voice to the darkest, most treasonous rumor in the kingdom, that the Queen was a whore. The term whoremaster dragged up even darker history. It reminded the world of the mysterious death of Dudley's first wife, Amy Robsart, who had been found with a broken neck at the bottom of a staircase in 1560. It reminded the world of Dudley's secret affairs and his illegitimate children. It painted the Queen's favorite, not as a statesman, but as a predator, a man of unbridled lust and violence. Robert Dudley heard these words. He sat in his castle surrounded by the artificial glory of his festival and seethed. He was the most powerful man in England, yet he could not silence this stubborn Catholic neighbor who looked down on him. Dudley knew he couldn't simply arrest the high sheriff for name-calling. It would look petty, and it would draw more attention to the insults. He needed something more. He needed a weapon that could shatter the Ardan legitimacy completely. He needed to turn the proud gentleman into a filthy traitor. He would have to wait 7 years for his opportunity. But Robert Dudley was a patient man. He let the insult fester. He let the hatred deepen. And he watched Park Hall with the unblinking eyes of a predator. He waited for a slip. He waited for a mistake. With the weapon of a madman now firmly in his grasp, Robert Dudley did not strike immediately. He let the poison of suspicion seep into the ground first. The incident at Kenilworth had been a public humiliation, but what followed was a masterclass in private machination. As the summer turned to autumn, the stage was being set not just for a trial, but for a purge. The collision between the Ardan pride and the Dudley ambition was about to move from the petty squabbles of property lines to the lethal arena of high treason. But to fully grasp the devastation that was about to be unleashed, we must look away from the castles of the mighty and peer into the mind of the man who would become the unwitting instrument of their destruction. To understand how the trap closed around Edward Arden, we must first breathe in the suffocating air of 1583. It was a year where the very atmosphere of England seemed charged with static electricity, waiting for a spark. The kingdom was on edge. The Throckmorton plot, a conspiracy involving foreign invasion and the liberation of Mary, Queen of Scots, was unraveling in the shadows. Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's spymaster, was intercepting letters, cracking codes, and turning servants against their masters. Paranoia was the currency of the realm. In Warwickshire, the Catholic gentry lived in a state of suspended animation. They attended their secret masses with the curtains drawn. They spoke in code. They knew that the old faith was dying, strangled by fines and the relentless pressure of the Anglican Church. But in the house of Edward Arden, defiance still burned. Ardan, secure in his ancient lineage, believed himself immune to the paranoia of the capital. He believed that the law required proof of a crime, not just proof of a belief. He was tragically mistaken. The state did not need a crime, it needed a scapegoat. And in October of that fevered year, the scapegoat appeared, walking down a muddy road, mumbling to himself. John Somerville was a young man of 23. He was well-born, the master of Edstone Hall, and married to Margaret Arden, the daughter of Edward Arden. By all accounts, he should have been a happy, prosperous country squire. But inside John Somerville's head, a tempest was raging. Contemporary records describe him as distracted, furious, and plagued by heady thoughts. In the modern lexicon of psychiatry, we would likely recognize the onset of severe schizophrenia, or perhaps a manic depressive episode triggered by the intense religious pressure of his environment. He was a devout Catholic living in a world that called his God a lie. He was surrounded by whispers of martyrdom and apocalypse. His mind, fragile and porous, absorbed the political tension of the era and twisted it into a divine command. By the autumn of 1583, Somerville was no longer living in reality. He spent his days pacing the halls of Edstone, muttering about serpents and vipers. He stopped sleeping. He became convinced of a terrifying singular truth. Queen Elizabeth was not merely a heretic monarch. She was the Antichrist. She was the beast of Revelation. And he, John Somerville, had been chosen by God to strike her down. The break came on October 25th. It was a gray, damp morning. Somerville woke with a clarity that only madness can provide. He did not pack a bag. He did not saddle a horse. He did not gather provisions or coin for the journey. He simply dressed, took a rusted sword from the wall, and walked out the front door. His destination was London, over 100 miles away. Consider the absurdity of this. A true assassin, a Jesuit agent, or a political conspirator would have moved in silence. They would have ridden fast horses, changed disguises, and used safe houses. Somerville did none of this. He walked. He was a lone figure trudging through the Warwickshire mud, his eyes fixed on a horizon only he could see. As he walked, the pressure in his mind spilled out of his mouth. He began to shout at the empty fields. He wasn't whispering treason. He was broadcasting it. The journey was a slow-motion disaster. Somerville stopped at inns along the road, not to rest, but to preach. At a tavern in Oxfordshire, he terrified the patrons. He didn't speak of politics, he spoke of blood. He pulled out his rusty sword and swung it at invisible enemies. He declared to a room full of strangers that he was going to the court to shoot the queen. He used the specific word dag, a heavy, short-barreled pistol that was the weapon of choice for assassins. "I will go up to the court and shoot the queen through with a dag," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I hope to see her head set upon a pole, for she is a serpent and a viper." This was not a plot. This was a breakdown. The people who saw him didn't see a threat to the state. They saw a sick boy who needed to be chained up for his own safety. But in the climate of 1583, Even the ravings of a lunatic were dangerous. The end of his journey came at a small inn near Aynhoe. Somerville, exhausted and feverish, attacked a group of Protestant bystanders. The local constable was summoned. It didn't take an army to subdue him, just a few strong hands to wrestle the sword away. They bound him and threw him in the local jail. At this point, the story should have ended. Somerville would be tried for disturbing the peace, perhaps locked away in a madhouse or executed locally for his seditious words. It was a tragedy, but a minor one. But then the report was sent to London. The report landed on the desk of the Privy Council. It was read by men like Walsingham and, crucially, the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley. Dudley scanned the details. A man shouting about killing the Queen, a Catholic, a madman. Then his eyes fell on the name, John Somerville of Edstone, and then the connection, son-in-law of Edward Arden. One can imagine the silence in the room as the pieces clicked into place. Dudley had been waiting 7 years to destroy Edward Arden. He had swallowed the insults about being a whoremaster and an adulterer. He had endured the lawsuits and the public defiance. Now fate had handed him the perfect weapon. The narrative was constructed instantly. The state's logic was cold and absolute. A young man does not simply wake up one day and decide to kill the Queen. He must be influenced. He must be groomed. Who groomed him? Who was the patriarch of his family? Who was the staunch Catholic who hated the Queen's favorite? Edward Arden. The order was given. This was no longer a matter of a lone lunatic. This was a popish plot. The machinery of the Tudor state, efficient and brutal, turned its gaze toward Park Hall. It was early November when the soldiers arrived at Park Hall. They did not knock. They came with warrants for high treason. Edward Arden was likely at dinner or in his study when the doors were breached. The sanctuary he had built, the house that had stood since the Middle Ages, was suddenly filled with the boots of the Queen's Guard. They tore through the rooms, ripping tapestries from the walls, smashing chests open, searching for the non-existent invasion plans or letters to the Pope. They found nothing of the sort. They found only rosary beads, a few Catholic prayer books, and the vestments of a priest. They arrested everyone. They took Edward Arden, the proud lord who had refused to bow. They took his wife, Mary, a woman of noble birth. They took his daughter. And trembling in the corner, disguised in his gardener's clothes, they found the prize, Father Hugh Hall. The family was dragged from their ancestral home. They were not taken to the local jail in Warwick. They were marched to London. The journey was a public humiliation. Arden, who had once ridden these roads as High Sheriff, was now paraded in chains, the mud of the road splattering the clothes he had worn with such dignity. They were thrown into the Tower of London. The Tower was not just a prison, it was an interrogation factory. The lieutenant of the Tower, Sir Owen Hopton, was an expert in breaking men, but the target of their fiercest attention was not Edward Arden, not yet. Arden was too tough, too proud. He would deny everything until his dying breath. The weak link was the priest. Father Hugh Hall was an old man. He had spent years living in fear, hiding in attics and priest holes. He was frail. The interrogators knew that if they could break the priest, they could hang the Lord. They took Hugh Hall down to the lower levels, to the room where the instruments were kept. They strapped the old priest to the rack, a simple, brutal frame designed to tear a man asunder. As the levers turned, the wooden rollers pulled his body in opposite directions until the silence of the dungeon was broken by the sickening pop of dislocating joints. Shoulders first, then hips. Ligaments snapped like dry twigs. They asked him about the plot. "There is no plot," Hall gasped. Somerville is mad. They turned the handle. The questioning continued for days. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a specific story. They wanted Hall to say that Somerville's madness was actually a holy mission. They wanted him to say that Edward Arden had blessed the enterprise. Under the agony of the rack, with his body broken and his spirit crushed, Hugh Hall finally gave them what they wanted. He whispered the lies that would sign Edward Arden's death warrant. He confessed that yes, Arden had known. Yes, Arden had said that killing the Queen would be a meritorious act. Yes, the madness of the son-in-law was a weapon forged by the father-in-law. The confession was scribbled down by a clerk. It was signed with a trembling hand. With the priest's confession in hand, the case was closed. It didn't matter that Somerville was clearly insane. It didn't matter that Arden had never left his house. The law of constructive treason was broad enough to catch them all. The indictment was drawn up. It charged that Edward Arden, Mary Arden, Hugh Hall, and John Somerville had compassed and imagined the death of the Queen. It claimed that they had conspired to kill and destroy Her Majesty and to subvert the estate of the realm. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction. It transformed a domestic tragedy into a national crisis. The trap was now perfectly laid. The madness of the son-in-law had been legally transmuted into the treason of the father-in-law, and the confession, extracted through the breaking of bones, provided the necessary script for the state to follow. Yet a confession in a dungeon is merely ink on paper. For the crown to make its point to the people of England, it needed a spectacle. The private agony of the Tower had to be dragged into the public light of the courtroom. As the winter fog settled over London, the machinery of justice began to grind toward its inevitable conclusion, moving the tragedy from the shadows of interrogation to the grand, terrifying theater of the Guildhall. On December 16th, 1583, the grey stone facade of London's Guildhall loomed out of the fog, swallowing the small procession of prisoners brought from the Tower. The Guildhall was the civic heart of the city, a place of banquets and commerce, but today it was a theater for the Crown's vengeance. Inside, the great hall was packed. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the sharp metallic tang of fear. The gallery was filled with spectators, merchants, apprentices, and minor courtiers, all eager to see the Warwickshire traitors. They had heard the rumors: a plot to shoot the Queen, a madman with a sword, a nest of popish vipers. They wanted blood. At the bar stood the accused, Edward Arden, gaunt and pale from weeks in the Tower's damp cells, his wife Mary, clutching a rosary, the broken priest, Hugh Hall, who had to be supported because his limbs no longer worked properly, and John Somerville, whose eyes darted around the room, seeing demons in the rafters. The judges sat on a raised dais, robed in scarlet and ermine. Among them were men who knew exactly what was expected of them. They were not there to weigh evidence. They were there to deliver a verdict that had already been decided in the private chambers of Robert Dudley. The clerk of the Crown stood to read the indictment. His voice boomed through the hall, reciting a list of crimes that sounded less like legal charges and more like a fever dream, that Edward Arden of Park Hall did traitorously compass and imagine the death of our sovereign lady the Queen, that he did incite and abet John Somerville to undertake a wicked enterprise against Her Majesty's person, that he did harbor and comfort Hugh Hall, a seminarist priest and enemy of the realm. The core of the prosecution's case was a legal concept known as constructive treason. In the 16th century, you did not need to commit a violent act to be a traitor. You did not even need to plan a specific violent act. If your words, your beliefs, or your general attitude could be construed as imagining the Queen's death, you were guilty. The Crown Prosecutor painted a vivid, terrifying picture. He described Park Hall not as a family home, but as a den of sedition. He argued that Somerville's madness was not an illness, but a weapon. He claimed that Ardan had filled the young man's head with poison, winding him up like a clockwork soldier and pointing him toward London. "Look at this man," the prosecutor thundered, pointing a bony finger at Somerville. "He is but the arrow. Edward Arden is the bow." Edward Arden stood alone. He had no defense counsel. In treason trials of the era, the accused were not permitted lawyers. They had to defend themselves against the best legal minds in the kingdom. But Arden was articulate, educated, and fueled by a burning righteous anger. He did not cower. When it was his turn to speak, he straightened his back, looking every inch the Saxon lord. "My lords," he began, his voice raspy but steady, "I stand here accused of madness, not treason. Look at my son-in-law. Look at him." He gestured to Somerville, who was muttering to himself, oblivious to the gravity of the moment. "Does this look like the instrument of a conspiracy?" Arden asked. "If I were truly a traitor, if I truly wished to harm Her Majesty, would I send a boy who cannot find his own way to the privy? Would I send a man who screams his intentions to every innkeeper on the road? This is not a plot. This is a tragedy." Arden dismantled the logic of the state. He admitted he was a Catholic. "If prayer is treason, then I am a traitor," he said. He admitted he hated Robert Dudley. "I have called the Earl of Leicester a whoremaster, and for that I may be sued for slander. But I have never raised my hand against the Queen." He turned to the jury, 12 men who were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "Do not mistake a feud between neighbors for a war against the crown. I am here because I refuse to wear a badge. I am here because I would not let a tyrant steal my land." For a moment the hall was silent. Arden's words rang with the clarity of truth. The narrative of the popish plot seemed to crumble in the face of this dignified, angry old man. But the prosecution had a trump card. They brought out the confession of Hugh Hall. They did not bring the priest to the stand to be cross-examined for fear he might retract his words or reveal the torture he had endured. Instead, they simply read his signed deposition. "I, Hugh Hall, do confess that Edward Arden did frequently wish for the Queen's death, that he did bless John Somerville's enterprise, that he promised him salvation for the act." As the words were read, Arden stared at the priest. Hall kept his head bowed, weeping silently. He could not look his master in the eye. Arden did not shout at him. He knew what the rack did to men. He knew that this confession was not written in ink, but in pain. "This is the speech of the torture chamber," Arden cried out. "This is not evidence. This is agony transcribed." But it was enough. The law required 2 witnesses for treason, but in practice a written confession and a circumstantial web were sufficient. The judges instructed the jury. They reminded them of the danger to the Queen. They reminded them of the recent plots. They reminded them subtly of the power of the Earl of Leicester. The jury did not deliberate for long. To acquit Edward Arden would be to accuse Robert Dudley of a frame-up. No man in that jury box was willing to risk his own neck for a stubborn Catholic squire. The foreman stood. He avoided Arden's gaze. Guilty. The word hung in the cold air like a guillotine blade. Guilty for Edward Arden. Guilty for Mary Arden. Guilty for Hugh Hall. Guilty for John Somerville. The sentence was pronounced immediately. It was the statutory penalty for high treason. "You shall be taken from this place to the prison from whence you came, and from there to the place of execution. You shall be hanged by the neck, cut down while you are yet alive. your privy parts cut off and burned before your face, your bowels taken out and burned, your head severed from your body, and your body divided into 4 quarters to be disposed of at her Majesty's pleasure. And may God have mercy on your souls." Mary Arden screamed. Edward Arden stood like a stone statue, his face a mask of contempt. He had expected this. He had known, from the moment he refused the livery at Kenilworth, that this day would come. The prisoners were taken to Newgate Prison to await their fate. The execution was set for December 20th. With the convenient death of John Somerville, the last unpredictable element of the drama had been removed. There would be no erratic outbursts on the scaffold, no raving contradictions to mar the solemnity of the state's vengeance. The narrative was sealed as tightly as the coffin of the young madman. Now only the final act remained, the physical destruction of the patriarch. As the long night in Newgate Prison gave way to a cold, iron-gray dawn, the focus shifted from the legal fiction of the courtroom to the brutal reality of the executioner's block. The time for words was over. The time for blood had arrived. The morning of December 20th, 1583, was bitter. A gray iron sky hung low over London, promising snow that would not fall, trapping the smoke of thousands of coal fires in the narrow streets. At the gates of Newgate Prison, the crowd had already gathered. They were not there for a celebration. They were there for the theater of death. Edward Arden was brought out in chains. He was not granted the dignity of walking to his death, nor the mercy of a cart. For a traitor, the punishment began the moment he left his cell. He was bound to a hurdle, a flat, rough wooden sled or wicker panel, lacking wheels, designed to be dragged directly over the cobblestones. He was laid on his back, his wrists tied fast. A horse was hitched to the front of the hurdle. When the beast lurched forward, Arden's head snapped back against the wood. The journey to Smithfield was a mile of torture. The sled scraped and bounced over the uneven streets, through the freezing mud and the filth of the open sewers. The crowd pressed in tight. Some jeered, shouting "Papist" and "Traitor." Others, seeing the white hair and the noble bearing of the man, fell silent, sensing that this was not a common criminal meeting his end. Arden stared up at the sky, his body bruising with every jolt. He passed the familiar landmarks of the city he had known as a gentleman, the shops where he had bought velvet, the inns where he had drunk wine. Now he was meat being dragged to the butcher. Smithfield was a vast open space, traditionally used for livestock markets and tournaments, but its most famous crop was human ash and blood. It was here that Bloody Mary had burned the Protestants. It was here that the state now purged its enemies. In the center of the square stood the gallows, 2 upright beams and a crossbar. Beneath it, a ladder. Beside it, a large fire was already roaring, the flames licking at a cauldron of boiling water. A butcher's block sat nearby, stained dark from previous uses. The executioner, a man whose face was hidden or averted, stood ready with his tools, a long knife, a cleaver, and an axe. Arden was untied from the hurdle. He stood up, shaking the mud from his clothes. He was bruised and stiff, but he refused the help of the guards. He walked to the foot of the ladder. A silence descended on Smithfield. The crowd waited for the dying speech. It was customary for the condemned to confess their sins, praise the Queen, and accept their punishment as just. This was the script the state required. Edward Arden tore the script apart. He climbed the ladder, his steps heavy but sure. He turned to face the sea of faces. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not admit to a plot. "I call God to witness," his voice rang out, thin but clear in the cold air, "that I have never imagined the death of Her Majesty, nor any treason against her realm." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. perhaps looking for the agents of his enemy. "I die not for treason," he declared, "but for the envy of my enemy. I have offended no one but the Earl of Leicester. It is his hand that tightens this rope, not the law." It was a final act of defiance. Even with the noose around his neck, he was naming his killer. He was framing his execution not as justice, but as murder. The executioner did not let him finish. He kicked the ladder away. The drop was short. The rope snapped tight. Ardan's body jerked violently, twisting in the air. But the order for a traitor's death was specific: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The hanging was not meant to kill, it was meant to torture. The knot was placed to strangle, not to break the neck. Ardan kicked and thrashed, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging as he fought for air. The crowd watched the grim dance. He hung there for perhaps a minute, long enough to feel the terror of death, but not long enough to find the release of it. Then, at a signal from the sheriff, the executioner stepped forward and cut the rope. Ardan fell to the ground with a heavy thud. He was gasping, choking, his chest heaving as he sucked in the freezing air. He was alive, fully conscious. This was the drawing. The executioner and his assistants pounced on him. They stripped him naked on the bloody straw. The fire roared nearby, the heat blistering his skin even as the cold wind bit at his back. The brutality that followed was ritualistic. It was designed to dismantle the man, physically, symbolically, and spiritually. First, the castration. The executioner took the knife and removed Ardan's genitals. This was the symbolic end of his lineage, the destruction of his manhood, the final insult to the patriarch who had been so proud of his old blood. The severed parts were thrown into the fire before his still open eyes. Then, the evisceration. Because he had been cut down so quickly, Ardan was awake for this. He felt the cold steel of the knife as it sliced into his lower belly. He felt the tearing of the skin as the blade was drawn up toward his ribs. The executioner reached into the cavity of his body. The historical accounts are gruesome but consistent. The victim often watched their own bowels being pulled out. The executioner severed the organs and threw them into the flames. The smell of burning flesh, his own flesh, filled Ardan's nostrils. It is said that in these final moments, some men screamed, some prayed, and some simply went into shock. We do not know Ardan's final sound. We only know that his heart was still beating. Finally, the executioner reached up through the open torso. He found the diaphragm, cut through it, and grasped the heart. With a violent wrench, he tore it from the chest. Edward Arden died. The executioner held the dripping heart aloft, showing it to the crowd. "Behold the heart of a traitor," he shouted, "so perish all the Queen's enemies." The crowd, usually raucous, was reportedly subdued. They knew they had not just watched a criminal die. They had watched a man of ancient honor being butchered by a political machine. The death was only the beginning of the display. Ardan's body was hacked into 4 quarters. The limbs and torso were thrown into the cauldron of boiling water, seasoned with cumin and salt, not for flavor, but to preserve the meat from the birds and the rot, so that it could stay on display for longer. These quarters were then nailed up at the gates of the city, Aldgate, Moorgate, Bishopsgate, as a warning to any other Catholics who might think of defying the new men. But the head was the prize. It was dipped in tar to blacken and preserve it. It was taken to the southern gatehouse of London Bridge. There, amidst the forest of spikes that decorated the entrance to the city, the head of Edward Arden was impaled. It was placed deliberately. It sat right next to the rotting skull of the Earl of Desmond, another rebel noble. It stared blindly back toward Warwickshire, back toward Park Hall, back toward the land that had been stolen. The physical destruction of Edward Arden was complete. His heart had been burned, his body quartered, and his head raised as a grisly sentinel over the Thames. In the eyes of the court, the matter was closed, a traitor punished, a lesson taught. But terror has a way of seeping into the soil, poisoning the roots of a community long after the executioner has wiped his blade. While London moved on to its next scandal, the shockwave of Smithfield rolled back to the quiet woodlands of Warwickshire. It did not result in an uprising of swords, but in a retreat into silence, a silence in which a young, observant kinsman began to understand that the true history of his age was being written not in laws, but in blood. When the news of the butchery at Smithfield reached Warwickshire, it did not arrive with a scream, but with a terrified silence. The execution of Edward Arden was a seismic event that shook the very foundations of the local society. For centuries, the Arden name had been a shield. Now it was a target. The message from London was clear. If the head of the ancient house of Arden could be gutted like a pig for insulting the Queen's favorite, no one was safe. The local gentry, both Catholic and Protestant, retreated behind their high walls. They burned their letters. They dismissed their servants who might be spies. The old faith went deeper underground. The priests who had once moved with relative freedom now vanished into the priest holes, tight, suffocating hiding places built behind fireplaces and under staircases. Park Hall, once the seat of defiance, became a carcass. The crown's agents stripped it bare. The tapestries, the silver, the livestock, everything of value was seized to pay for the costs of the trial and execution. The stone walls that Edward Arden had thought impregnable were now just a shell, echoing with the ghosts of a destroyed family. His widow Mary was left to wander the empty rooms, a living testament to the cruelty of the Earl of Leicester. While Robert Dudley sat in London, enjoying the fruits of his vengeance, the dirty work in Warwickshire was left to his local enforcer, Sir Thomas Lucy. Lucy is a crucial figure in this tragedy. He was a magistrate, a staunch Protestant, and a man desperate to curry favor with the regime. He resided at Charlecote Park, a grand estate just a few miles from Stratford-upon-Avon. It was Lucy who had arrested Somerville. It was Lucy who had raided Park Hall. It was Lucy who had personally escorted the prisoners to the Tower. To the locals, Lucy was a collaborator. He was the man who had sold out his neighbors to the new men at court. He represented the new sharp-edged authority that had replaced the old feudal bonds of loyalty. He was pompous, legalistic, and utterly ruthless in his pursuit of papists. And watching all of this, the raids, the arrests, the arrogance of Sir Thomas Lucy, was a young man of 19 living in the market town of Stratford, a young man whose mother was an Arden. William Shakespeare was born in 1564. His mother, Mary Arden, was a daughter of Robert Arden of Wilmcote, a cadet branch of the same family that Edward headed. To the young William, Edward Arden was not just a distant relative, he was the head of the house, the symbol of his mother's noble blood. In 1583, Shakespeare was at a crossroads. He was married with a young child and twins on the way. He was watching his father, John Shakespeare, fall into financial ruin and social disgrace, likely due to his own Catholic sympathies and the crushing fines imposed by the state. Then came the catastrophe. Imagine the impact on a sensitive, brilliant 19-year-old mind. He saw his kinsman, a man of honor, destroyed by a rigged legal system. He saw the madness of Somerville weaponized by the state. He saw the hypocrisy of the court, where a man like Dudley, an adulterer and a suspected murderer, could sentence a moral man like Ardan to death. Most importantly, he saw the power of language. Ardan died because of words. He died because he spoke the truth about a powerful man. Shakespeare learned a brutal lesson that winter. Power does not care about truth. It cares about the narrative. And the only way to fight power is to control the narrative. There is a famous legend in Shakespearean biography that the young poet was forced to flee Stratford after poaching deer from Sir Thomas Lucy's estate at Charlecote. For centuries, this was treated as a bit of youthful folklore, a prank gone wrong. But in the light of the Arden execution, the deer poaching story takes on a darker, more political hue. Poaching was not just theft. It was an act of class warfare. It was a rejection of the landowner's rights. If Shakespeare did clash with Sir Thomas Lucy, it was likely not over a deer, but over the destruction of his family. Lucy was the man who had destroyed the Ardens. He was the face of the regime that was hunting Catholics. It is entirely plausible that Shakespeare's departure from Stratford in the late 1580s was not a leisurely career move, but a flight from the same forces that had killed Edward Arden. He vanished into the lost years, only to re-emerge in London, the very city where his kinsman's head was still rotting on a spike. When Shakespeare began to write, he did not produce pamphlets or political tracts. He was too smart for that. That was how you got disemboweled at Smithfield. Instead, he built a theater of memory. He used the stage to put the regime on trial, safely cloaked in the guise of history and fiction. Scholars have long noted the bitterness toward the new men and the corrupt judicial system in Shakespeare's plays. Look at Justice Shallow in The Merry Wives of Windsor and Henry IV, Part 2. Shallow is a bumbling, corrupt, self-important country magistrate who boasts of his authority and misuses the law. It is widely accepted that Shallow is a caricature of Sir Thomas Lucy. Through this character, Shakespeare took the man who had terrified Warwickshire and turned him into a laughingstock for the London crowds. It was a revenge more lasting than any sword strike. Look at Hamlet. A young prince returns home to find his father murdered and his mother remarried to a usurper. The court is a prison filled with spies, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who report to a corrupt authority. The theme of madness, real versus feigned, runs through the play. Is it a coincidence that Shakespeare wrote this while remembering John Somerville, the madman whose insanity was manipulated by the state to destroy a family? Look at King Lear. It is a play about the destruction of an old order, about a king stripped of his dignity, wandering in a storm, while ruthless, ambitious younger men and women tear the kingdom apart for profit. It is the story of the Ardens writ large. The ghost of Robert Dudley haunts the plays as well. In the history plays, Shakespeare frequently depicts the tension between the ancient nobility and the ambitious climbers. In Richard III and the Henry VI trilogy, the character of the Duke of Suffolk is portrayed as an arrogant, manipulative lover of the Queen, a man who rules the country through his influence over the monarch, bypassing the law. The parallels to Dudley and Elizabeth are striking. Shakespeare was writing in a minefield. He had to be careful. But for those who knew the code, for the Catholic gentry, for the survivors of the old families, the message was clear. Shakespeare was mourning the England that Edward Arden had died for. He was documenting the trauma of a world where honor was replaced by policy. While Shakespeare began the slow alchemical process of turning his family's tragedy into art, the architect of that tragedy, Robert Dudley, was discovering that vengeance comes with a price. He had won the battle for Warwickshire, crushing the ancient Ardan name under the heel of his influence. But he had underestimated the cosmic balance of justice. History often punishes the victor more cruelly than the victim. And as the 1580s wore on, the great Earl of Leicester would find that while he could kill a man, he could not kill the curse that seemed to rise from the blood-soaked cobbles of Smithfield. The final chapter of this saga belongs not to the rising poet, but to the falling lord. The snows of 1583 melted into the mud of 1584, washing away the blood at Smithfield, but the stain on the soul of England remained. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, had achieved his perfect victory. He had crushed the Ardens. He had silenced the man who called him a whoremaster. His crest, the bare and ragged staff, was now feared more than the royal lion in the Midlands. But victory in the Tudor court was a perishable commodity. Almost immediately after the execution of Edward Arden, the atmosphere around Dudley began to sour. He had expected the execution to solidify his power. Instead, it had exposed his cruelty. The whispers in the court corridors changed. Men no longer looked at him with envy, but with a cold, calculating wariness. If he could butcher a man like Ardan, a man of such ancient lineage, over a personal insult, who was safe? The Queen herself, Elizabeth I, was astute. She knew when her favorites had gone too far. Though she had signed the death warrant, she reportedly grew cool toward Dudley in the months that followed. She hated scandal, and the Arden affair was becoming a quiet, festering scandal. But the true retribution for Robert Dudley would not come from the Queen. It would come from fate itself. Dudley's greatest ambition was not just power for himself, but the establishment of a dynasty. He was desperate for a legitimate heir to carry on the Dudley name, to wash away the treason of his father and grandfather. He had married Lettice Knollys in secret, risking the Queen's wrath. In 1581 they had a son, Robert, styled as Lord Denbigh. The boy was the apple of Dudley's eye. He was known as the noble imp. He was healthy, strong, and destined for greatness. He was the vessel into which all of Dudley's stolen lands and accumulated titles would be poured. In July 1584, less than 7 months after Edward Arden was disemboweled, tragedy struck the house of Dudley. The noble imp, just 3 years old, suddenly fell ill at Wanstead. The best physicians in England were summoned. They bled him, they purged him, they prayed over him. Nothing worked. On July 19, 1584, the boy died. The devastation of Robert Dudley was total. He locked himself in his chambers. The man who had watched his enemies die without blinking now wept uncontrollably for his lost son. To the Catholic underground, to the surviving Ardens, and to the common people of Warwickshire, this was not a medical tragedy. It was divine judgment. It was the curse of the Ardens. They whispered that the blood of the innocent man at Smithfield had cried out to heaven, and God had taken Dudley's heir as payment. The bare and ragged staff was broken. Dudley would never have another legitimate child. The dynasty he had killed for, the legacy he had built on the ruins of the Arden family, died in a nursery in Wanstead. Dudley lived for another 4 years, but he was a hollow man. He threw himself into the war in the Netherlands, trying to regain his martial glory, but his campaign was a disaster of mismanagement and ego. He returned to England in 1587, older, fatter, and increasingly isolated. In 1588, the year of the Spanish Armada, he had a final moment of glory, riding beside the Queen at Tilbury. But as he traveled to Buxton to take the waters for his failing health, death found him. He died on September 4th, 1588, at Cornbury Park in Oxfordshire. It was a lonely death. He had no heir to hold his hand. His wife, Lettice, whom he had married for passion, was already moving on. She would marry a much younger man shortly after. When the news of his death reached the court, there was no great outpouring of grief. The queen locked herself away for a few days, keeping his last letter in her bedside box marked his last letter. But the court moved on instantly. His massive estates were seized by the crown to pay his staggering debts. Kenilworth Castle, the site of the lavish party where Edward Arden had refused the livery, began its slow decline into ruin. The man who had tried to be king of the Midlands was gone. He left behind no dynasty, only a crumbling castle, and a reputation stained by the blood of his neighbors. While the house of Dudley collapsed, the women of the Arden family were fighting a different kind of war. Mary Arden, Edward's widow, was left in a desperate position. Her husband was a convicted traitor. By law, all his property was forfeit to the crown. She was homeless, branded, and destitute. But Mary Arden had the same steel in her spine as her husband. She did not fade away. She petitioned the crown. She used every connection she had left. She argued that the lands were entailed, that they belonged to the family trust, not to Edward personally, and therefore could not be seized. It was a long, grinding legal battle. She was fighting the very men who had killed her husband, but remarkably, she won concessions. She managed to recover some of the family lands. She secured a small inheritance for her remaining children. And then there was Margaret Somerville, the widow of the madman John. She was young, with children to feed. Her husband's suicide had technically saved his property from confiscation, since he wasn't convicted, but the state tried to seize it anyway. Margaret fought back. She navigated the treacherous waters of Elizabethan probate law, facing down the same judges who had condemned her family. These women were the unsung heroes of the aftermath. They rebuilt the foundations of the family brick by brick. They ensured that while the head of the family was gone, the body would survive. The name Arden did not die at Smithfield. It went dormant like a seed in winter. The male line of Edward Arden continued, though diminished. His son, Robert Arden, eventually regained Park Hall, but the family never recovered its former glory. They remained quietly Catholic, paying their fines, staying out of politics, living in the shadow of the great tragedy. But the true resurrection of the Arden spirit happened in a different sphere entirely. We return to the young kinsman, William Shakespeare. In 1596, 12 years after the execution, William Shakespeare's only son, Hamnet, died at the age of 11. It was a crushing blow, mirroring the loss of Dudley's son. But unlike Dudley, Shakespeare had a way to transmute his grief into immortality. Shortly after his son's death, Shakespeare applied to the College of Arms for a coat of arms for his father, John. This was a significant move. It was an attempt to restore the gentle status of the Shakespeare family. The design he chose is telling. It featured a gold spear on a black bend, but it was the impaling, the combination with the mother's arms, that mattered. He requested to quarter his arms with the arms of the Ardens of Park Hall. The College of Arms dithered. The Ardens were traitors. Associating with them was still dangerous. But Shakespeare persisted. He wanted the world to know that he was of that blood. He wanted the badge of the traitor to be elevated to the badge of the gentleman. Although the quartering was never officially finalized in the records, likely due to political caution, Shakespeare used the Arden connection throughout his life to assert his status. He was not just a player, he was a gentleman of Warwickshire. He was an Arden. As the 1590s turned into the 1600s, the plays of Shakespeare began to conquer London, and in those plays the ghosts of 1583 kept walking. In As You Like It, the setting is the Forest of Arden. To a London audience, this was just a pastoral setting, a fairy tale wood. But to William Shakespeare, the Forest of Arden was real. It was the ancient woodland of his mother's family. It was the land that Edward Arden had died to protect. In the play, the good Duke Senior is banished to the forest by his usurping brother Duke Frederick. The rightful ruler is forced to live in exile, in the woods, with a band of loyal followers. Hath not old custom made this life more sweet than that of painted pomp? Are not these woods more free from peril than the envious court? It is a direct echo of the Arden philosophy. The court is envious and dangerous. The woods, the ancient land, are the place of truth and old custom. Shakespeare was rewriting the reality of Warwickshire. In his play, the usurper repents and the rightful duke is restored. It was the happy ending that Edward Arden never got. The execution of Edward Arden was a pivot point. It marked the definitive end of the medieval order in England, the moment when the central state proved it could crush the local feudal lords. But it also proved the limits of that power. You can kill a man. You can spike his head on a bridge. You can steal his land, but you cannot kill the story. The story of the Warwickshire Terror traveled. It was whispered in the inns of London. It traveled to the recusant colleges in France and Rome. It became a martyrology. And through the alchemy of Shakespeare, the trauma of that winter was sublimated into the greatest art the world has ever seen. The anxiety, the paranoia, the madness, the injustice, it all found a home in Hamlet, in Lear, in Macbeth. Edward Arden died a traitor's death. But today, millions of people who have never heard of Robert Dudley or the Earl of Leicester know the name Arden. They know it as the Forest of Imagination. They know it as the maiden name of the bard's mother. The Bear and Ragged Staff is a museum piece. The Arden name is living art. In the end, the head on the spike had the last laugh. Edward Arden's quarters were eventually taken down. His remains were gathered by the faithful and buried in secret, likely in the grounds of Park Hall or a nearby chapel. There is no grand monument to him, but in the shadowed corners of the Warwickshire churchyards, where the yew trees grow thick and ancient, the locals still whispered the story for generations. They told of the man who refused the badge. They told of the mad boy who walked to London. And they told of the priest who broke on the rack. It was a story of resistance. And as long as the plays of his kinsmen are performed, as long as audiences watch the innocent crushed by the machinery of power, the spirit of Edward Arden, the last true lord of the forest, will never truly die.